The first time she spoke to him, her voice shook so badly she had to press her knuckles to her lips to stop them trembling. "I know this is beneath you," she said, standing in the shadow of his office doorway, rain dripping from the hem of her coat onto marble floors that reflected a life she had never touched. "But if you don't help me, I don't know where else to go." He had been called many things in his life: visionary, ruthless, untouchable, but never a last hope. Elliot Harrow looked up slowly from the glass desk where numbers decided fates, empires, and sometimes entire cities. Outside, London burned with lights and ambition. Inside, a woman stood holding herself together by sheer will, eyes red not from the cold, but from nights that had no mercy. "Sit down," he said calmly, not unkindly, not curious either. Just controlled. She didn't move at first. People like him didn't say things twice, and people like her weren't used to being invited anywhere warm. When she finally sat, she perched on the edge of the chair as if afraid comfort might break her. "My name is Myra," she said. "I'm not here for charity. I'll work. I'll clean floors, file papers, anything. I just need help. Temporary help." Elliot studied her in silence. He noticed details others missed. The faint bruise hidden under makeup near her jaw, the way her hands instinctively shielded her ribs when she breathed too deeply, the exhaustion that no amount of pride could disguise. This wasn't desperation for money. This was fear. "You're in the wrong building if you think I employ pity," he replied. Her eyes lifted sharply, glassy but defiant. "I know. That's why I came." Something about that unsettled him. She told him only what she had to. An eviction notice folded and unfolded so many times it was soft as cloth. A younger brother who thought she was stronger than she felt. A past she didn't name, but which followed her like a second shadow. She never cried. Not once. Her begging was quiet, dignified, and far more dangerous to his composure than tears. When she finished, the room felt smaller. Elliot leaned back, fingers steepled. He had turned away men with perfect plans and powerful connections. He had said no to opportunities that made headlines. Yet here he was, staring at a woman who asked for nothing more than time and safety, and feeling a strange tightening in his chest. "You can stay in the guest apartment," he said at last. "For now." Her breath caught. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm offering." She stood abruptly, shaking her head. "I can't owe you." "You won't," he said. "You'll pay me back by surviving." That was the moment something shifted. The apartment was quiet, impossibly clean, and filled with the kind of silence that hummed. Myra slept on the sofa the first night, even though the bed was untouched and waiting. Old habits didn't dissolve just because the walls were safe. Elliot noticed. He noticed everything. Days passed. She cooked, cleaned, organized without being asked. She avoided his gaze but listened when he spoke. Slowly, her shoulders dropped an inch, then another. She laughed once, soft, surprised by the sound of herself, and froze as if afraid it might cost her. He found himself lingering, asking about her day, bringing extra groceries without explanation. Once, when thunder cracked across the sky and she flinched hard enough to drop a plate, he simply said, "It's just noise. You're safe here." The words sounded foreign in his mouth, but true. One evening, he found her on the balcony, knees drawn to her chest, staring at the city like it might swallow her whole. "You don't have to disappear when you're here," he said quietly. She didn't turn. "I don't know how to exist without being invisible." That confession settled between them, heavy and intimate. He realized then that she hadn't just asked him for help. She had unknowingly stepped into a life that had been perfectly structured to avoid exactly this: connection, responsibility, care. And somehow, without demanding it, without even expecting it, she had begun to feel like something dangerously close to home. But safety, he would soon learn, had a price. And the past she carried was already knocking, impatient, ready to remind them both that refuge was never meant to last forever. The knock came 3 nights later, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the calm like a blade against silk. Myra froze mid-step in the hallway, her breath stopping so abruptly it hurt. Her first instinct was to shrink, to vanish into the walls, but there was nowhere to go. The past didn't care how high the building stood or how thick the doors were. Elliot reached the entrance before she could speak. One glance at her face told him everything he needed to know. The color had drained from her skin, and her hands were shaking again, worse than the day she'd stood in his doorway. "Stay here," he said quietly.
She shook her head.
Please don't open it.
That alone made him place his hand firmly on the door.
When he opened it, a man stood there with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was well-dressed, confident in the way of someone who had never been told no often enough. His gaze flicked past Elliot's shoulder, already searching.
Evening, the man said.
I'm looking for Myra. She's not here, Elliot replied, voice even, unyielding.
The man chuckled. That's funny. Because she owes me. And people who owe me don't get to disappear.
Elliot didn't raise his voice.
He didn't need to. You're trespassing.
Leave. The smile slipped for a fraction of a second. Long enough for Elliot to notice. Long enough to confirm what he'd already suspected. This wasn't a misunderstanding.
This was a threat wrapped in charm.
I'll be back, the man said softly. Tell her that. The door closed with a finality that echoed through the apartment. Myra slid down the wall the moment she heard the lock engage, arms wrapped around herself like a shield that had failed too many times. Elliot crouched in front of her, close enough that she could feel his presence without being trapped by it.
He won't stop, she whispered.
He never does.
Then he won't be welcome, Elliot said. She laughed weakly. You don't understand.
He ruins people.
Elliot's jaw tightened. So do I, he said calmly.
The difference is, I choose who deserves it. She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if seeing the weight behind the tailored suits and measured words. For the first time since arriving, she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but silently, tears slipping down as her body finally gave up the fight. He didn't touch her until she leaned forward first, forehead resting against his shoulder. When his hand came to her back, it was steady, grounding, a quiet promise he hadn't spoken aloud. The days that followed changed the air between them.
Security doubled. Calls were made. Names were checked.
Elliot moved with an efficiency that bordered on ruthless, but never once did he treat Myra like a problem to be managed. She was included, informed, protected without being controlled.
Still, fear lingered.
At night, she woke gasping from dreams where doors wouldn't lock and voices knew her name. Elliot began leaving his study light on, door open, a silent signal. She never knocked.
She never had to. Just seeing the glow steadied her breathing.
One morning, she found him in the kitchen before dawn, tie loosened, eyes shadowed with exhaustion.
You didn't sleep, she said. Neither did you, he replied. The honesty surprised them both. She started talking then.
Not everything, not all at once, but enough. About how she'd trusted the wrong person.
How help had come with conditions. How debt turned into ownership before she realized what was happening.
She spoke without embellishment, without asking for sympathy. Elliot listened, fists clenched at his sides, anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior.
Not the reckless kind. The focused kind. The kind that planned. You should have told me sooner, he said quietly. I was afraid you'd send me away, she admitted.
The idea struck him harder than he expected. Myra, he said, voice firm, you don't have to earn the right to be safe here. Something fragile shifted in her chest at those words. Yet safety, once tasted, made her restless. She began to flinch less, but think more. Watching how Elliot moved through his world with authority and solitude. How people deferred to him but never truly knew him. How his kindness came not from softness, but from choice. You're lonely, she said one evening, almost to herself.
He didn't deny it.
Loneliness is quieter than betrayal.
She nodded slowly.
I used to think being alone was safer too. Their eyes met, an understanding passing between them that neither of them had planned, and neither of them could undo. The man returned a week later, this time not to the door, but to the edges of Elliot's world. A warning delivered through channels that didn't leave fingerprints. Myra felt it before Elliot told her, the tightening in the air, the sense of being watched. I don't want to be the reason someone gets hurt, she said that night, standing by the window. Elliot stepped beside her. You're not the reason, he said. You're the line. She turned, confusion clouding her expression. The line I won't let anyone cross. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet war beginning behind glass and steel. Myra leaned into the warmth beside her, just slightly, just enough to remind herself she wasn't facing it alone anymore. And for Elliot, that was the moment he realized this was no longer about protection. It was about keeping her. Keeping her, he learned, was far more dangerous than protecting her. The first real crack appeared in the smallest moment. Myra was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, humming softly as she chopped vegetables. The sound was hesitant, untrained, but it filled the apartment with something warm and ordinary. Elliot stood in the doorway longer than he should have, struck by the realization that this quiet domestic scene, felt more intimate than any boardroom victory he'd ever claimed. When she noticed him watching, she stopped humming at once. "Sorry," she said automatically, as if joy were an inconvenience.
"Don't," he replied.
"It's nice." The word hung between them, almost shy. Later that day, his phone rang with a name he hadn't expected to see again.
Victor Hale. Old associate. New enemy.
The man at the door had been a messenger, not the master. Elliot listened without interrupting, face unreadable, mind already several steps ahead. "You're sheltering something that belongs to me," Victor said smoothly over the line.
"She's not a thing," Elliot replied. A soft laugh.
"Everything is, eventually. You just pay a higher price for the ones you pretend aren't." When the call ended, Elliot stood motionless, the weight of the threat settling into his bones.
This wasn't about money.
It never had been. It was about control, about proving that no one escaped unscathed. Myra sensed the shift before he said a word. She always did. "He called, didn't he?" she asked quietly that evening. Elliot nodded. "Yes."
Her shoulders sagged.
"Then it's getting worse." "It's getting clearer," he corrected. "Which means I can end it." She turned to face him fully, fear flickering beneath determination. "You can't destroy him without consequences." "I'm aware." "And if the consequences touch you because of me?" she pressed. Elliot met her gaze without hesitation. Then they were coming anyway.
The truth of that silenced her.
His life had never been safe, it had simply been insulated. And now, she was inside those walls, seeing the cost.
That night, she packed a bag.
He found her at the door, coat on, hands shaking as she zipped it closed. "You're not leaving," he said, not as a command, but a plea disguised as certainty. "I have to," she whispered. "This isn't protection anymore.
It's a war."
"I won't be the reason you bleed."
He stepped closer.
"You're the reason I fight." The words slipped out before he could stop them, raw and unarmored. Myra's breath hitched. She looked at him as if the ground beneath her had shifted. "I never asked you to care," she said. "No," he replied. "You just made it impossible not to." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, she set the bag down. Not because the danger had vanished, but because something stronger had risen in its place.
The retaliation came quietly. Accounts frozen. Deals collapsed.
Victor Hale's empire began to fracture, piece by meticulous piece. Elliot moved with precision, never revealing his hand, never rushing. Myra watched from the edges, guilt twisting in her chest as she saw the power he wielded on her behalf. "You don't owe me," he reminded her one evening when she voiced it. "I know," she said. "That's what scares me." The final confrontation came not with fists or threats, but with truth. Victor requested a meeting.
Neutral ground.
Public enough to discourage violence, private enough for intimidation. Elliot agreed.
Myra insisted on going. "I won't hide anymore," she said.
"If this ends, it ends with me standing."
Elliot didn't argue. He simply stayed close.
Victor arrived with the same polished smile, but his eyes were sharper now, calculating loss. "You chose the wrong man to run to," he told Myra, ignoring Elliot entirely. She didn't flinch.
"I didn't run," she said.
"I survived."
Victor turned to Elliot then.
"You think you can erase what I did?" "No," Elliot replied calmly.
"But I can make sure you never do it again."
The conversation was short.
Devastating.
Evidence laid bare.
Alliances withdrawn. Doors closed.
Victor left with his power bleeding out through legal channels he'd once manipulated with ease. When it was over, Myra realized she was trembling, not from fear, but from release. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. She laughed, sudden and unrestrained, the sound breaking free like a bird from a cage. Elliot watched her, something aching and hopeful in his chest.
"You did it," she said.
"We did," he corrected. In the weeks that followed, normalcy crept in cautiously.
Myra found work.
Small, honest, hers. She began to take up space without apology. Elliot returned to his world, but it no longer felt sealed off from hers. One night, As they stood on the balcony again, city lights reflecting in the glass, she spoke softly. I don't know what comes next. Elliot glanced at her, then back at the horizon. Neither do I.
She smiled at that.
That used to terrify me.
And now?
Now it feels like freedom. She turned toward him, close enough that he could feel her warmth, but not touching.
Not yet.
What happens, she asked, voice barely above a whisper, when the safe place starts to feel like more than shelter? Elliot didn't answer right away. He simply reached out, his hand hovering between them, offering without claiming. Outside, the city held its breath, as if waiting to see whether safety could turn into something far more dangerous, and far more beautiful. Her question stayed with him long after the night air cooled and the city lights dimmed into something softer. Elliot found himself replaying the moment in quiet flashes, the way her voice had lowered, the careful courage it took to ask, the fragile hope hiding beneath fear. For a man who had built his life on certainty, this uncertainty was unsettling in a way that felt almost holy. The next morning, Myra left early for work. Elliot stood by the window long after she'd gone, watching the street below with a vigilance that had nothing to do with threats anymore. When she returned that evening, cheeks flushed from the cold and a smile tugging at her lips, something in him loosened. I brought dinner, she said, holding up a paper bag. I hope that's okay.
It is, he replied, and meant more than the words.
They ate together at the kitchen counter, shoulders nearly touching, conversation drifting easily from trivial things to silences that felt comfortable rather than heavy. At one point, Myra laughed again, that freer sound she was beginning to trust. Elliot realized he'd started measuring his days by moments like this. Later, she lingered while washing the dishes, gaze unfocused. I used to think safety meant walls, she said.
Locks. Distance. Silence. And now? He asked. Now I think it's being seen, she said quietly.
And not being punished for it. He leaned against the counter, studying her profile. You're not a burden, Myra. She turned, surprised. I didn't say I was.
No, he said.
But you've lived like you believe it. The truth of that softened her expression. She set the plate down, hands damp, uncertain.
What if I stay? She asked.
Not because I'm afraid to leave, but because I want to be here. His heart beat once, hard and decisive. Then stay. The days that followed were gentle in a way neither of them had expected.
No grand gestures. No declarations. Just shared mornings and late-night conversations.
Elliot began leaving earlier and coming home sooner. Myra filled the apartment with life, flowers on the table, music playing softly while she worked, warmth settling into corners that had been cold for years.
Still, restraint lingered.
They circled each other with care, both aware of how easily this could fracture if rushed. One evening, a storm rolled in, thunder rattling the windows with familiar violence. Myra stiffened instinctively, breath shortening. Elliot moved without thinking, standing close enough that his presence was a barrier between her and the noise.
It's just a storm, he said softly.
You're not alone. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his sleeve. This time, she didn't pull away. The touch was small, but it changed everything. She looked up at him, eyes searching, asking without words if this was still safe. Elliot didn't kiss her.
He didn't move at all. He let her choose.
Slowly, deliberately, she rested her forehead against his chest. His arms came around her then, careful but firm, holding her as the thunder faded into distance. When she finally stepped back, there was something new in her gaze, steadiness.
I'm not afraid of you, she said. He met her eyes.
I would never want you to be. The line between shelter and something deeper thinned after that. They began to share stories not marked by pain. Myra talked about the dreams she'd abandoned, the small joys she'd once dismissed as childish. Elliot spoke of the boy he'd been before ambition hardened him, the cost of always being in control. You don't have to be strong with me, she told him one night. He exhaled slowly. I don't know how not to be. She smiled sadly. We'll learn. The call came late, pulling Elliot back into the harsher edges of his world. A complication. An unfinished thread Victor had left behind. Nothing immediate, but enough to remind him that safety was never absolute. He considered keeping it from her. Then he remembered her words about being seen. There's something I need to handle, he said. It might get messy. Myra didn't panic. She nodded. Do you want me to leave? No,
he said immediately.
I want you informed.
The distinction mattered.
That night, she waited for him, curled on the sofa with a book she wasn't reading. When he returned, exhaustion etched into his features, she stood and crossed the room without hesitation.
You're home, she said simply.
He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair for a moment longer than necessary. Yes. She felt it then, the shift in him, the quiet surrender, the realization that this place, this person, had become something he would defend not out of obligation, but out of love he hadn't named yet. Myra rested her hand over his heart, feeling its steady rhythm. I think, she said softly, that the safe place isn't the apartment.
He met her gaze, something unguarded shining through.
Then what is it?
She didn't answer.
Instead, she stayed, her presence speaking what words still could not. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, unaware that within those walls, two people were standing at the edge of something neither had planned, but both were beginning to choose. The truth arrived quietly, as it always did, not with sirens or shattered glass, but with a moment so still it felt suspended in time. Myra woke before dawn, the city barely breathing beyond the windows. For the first time in years, she realized she had slept through the night.
No nightmares.
No sudden panic clawing her awake.
Just rest.
Real, unbroken rest. She turned her head and found Elliot already awake, lying beside her fully clothed on the edge of the bed, as if guarding the space between past and present.
He hadn't touched her while she slept. He hadn't needed to.
You didn't run, he said softly when he noticed her watching.
She smiled faintly.
Neither did you.
That was when she understood. Safety was no longer something he provided.
It was something they had built together, brick by invisible brick, through patience and choice. The unfinished thread finally snapped a week later. Victor's last move was desperate, reckless. An attempt to reclaim control through exposure rather than power.
Documents leaked. Stories twisted.
Myra's name threatened to become a spectacle. Elliot moved fast, not to silence the truth, but to reshape it. He stood in the open, refused secrecy, refused intimidation. For the first time, he let the world see what he was protecting. Not an asset. A person. Myra watched the press conference from home, hands clenched in her lap, heart racing. When Elliot said her name, not as a liability, but as someone wronged, someone worthy of dignity, the weight she'd carried for so long finally cracked. She cried then, openly, without shame, without fear of consequence. By the time Victor disappeared from headlines, stripped of influence and hunted by the very systems he once manipulated, Myra felt something close to peace.
Life did not return to what it had been. It became something better.
She moved into the bedroom properly, folding her clothes into drawers that were no longer borrowed space. She planted herbs on the balcony, insisting they needed something alive to care for. Elliot let her rearrange the apartment, even though he pretended to grumble when she moved his books.
He liked the way she made room for herself.
One evening, as rain traced familiar patterns against the glass, Myra stood in front of him, hands steady.
I need to know, she said.
If I stay, it's not because I need saving. Elliot met her gaze, every wall lowered. I don't want to save you. Then why do you want me here? He stepped closer, resting his forehead against hers. Because you make this place human. That was the moment she kissed him.
Not desperate. Not rushed. Just certain. The world didn't end.
It didn't explode into chaos or demand payment for their happiness.
It simply continued.
And in that continuation, they found rhythm.
Months passed.
Myra grew stronger, not because she forgot what had hurt her, but because it no longer defined her.
She laughed louder. She argued when she disagreed. She trusted.
Elliot learned how to rest without guilt, how to let someone see his flaws without turning them into weapons.
They were not perfect. They were honest.
One night, standing once more on the balcony where it had all begun, Myra looked out at the city lights and smiled. I used to think safe places were rare, she said. Temporary. Elliot wrapped an arm around her, solid and warm. What do you think now?
I think they are built, she said.
By people who choose each other every day.
He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice low and certain.
Then I'll keep choosing you. Below them, the city glowed, indifferent, relentless, alive. But up there, above the noise and fear and past mistakes, two people stood unbroken. She had begged a millionaire for help.
She had expected money. She had expected a door that would close eventually.
What she found instead was something far more dangerous, far more powerful. A place where she was not owned, not rescued, not hidden.
A place where she was home.
And for Elliot Harrow, the man who once believed he was untouchable, she became the only thing worth being vulnerable for. Not because she needed him, but because together, they were finally safe.